Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm Jacqueline Jones, the President and CEO of the Foundation for Child Development. On behalf of our Board of Directors and staff, I'm delighted to welcome our stellar group of speakers and attendees. Thank you all for taking the time to join us for today's webinar. The Foundation for Child Development has a long history of identifying and filling gaps in research knowledge related to young children, and then connecting that research to changes in policy and practice. In 2020, the Foundation released a publication entitled Getting It Right, Using Implementation Research to Improve Outcomes in Early Care and Education. In that work, several prominent early childhood researchers asked, what do we know and what else needs to be explored to better understand how early childhood interventions are working, for whom, and under what conditions? The publication provided insights into the value of including implementation research in the study of early care and education to improve programs, policies, and ultimately to achieve stronger outcomes for young children. Last week, the Foundation announced the release of a new Getting It Right resource entitled Getting It Right, the Conversation Guide for Preparing the Next Generation of Implementation Researchers. This conversation guide is tailored for use by higher education faculty who are preparing future applied researchers. We hope the guide will support faculty to initiate and sustain conversations with students about effective early care and education, what needs to be understood, and how understanding the context in which interventions are implemented can enhance outcomes for young children. This project could not have been achieved without the very hard work of Sarah Vecchiotti, the Foundation's Vice President, who is today's moderator, Charisse Bramer, our Communications Officer, and Amy Dombrow, who masterfully transformed ideas into words on a page. I'm looking forward to this discussion, and I will now turn things over to Dr. Vecchiotti. Sarah, it's yours.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I am delighted to have the honor of moderating today's roundtable discussion, as well as introducing our esteemed speakers. As Jacqueline mentioned, with both the Getting It Right publication and the follow-up conversation guide, the Foundation sought to promote the value of implementation research. Now is the moment for early care and education researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to identify the critical elements of effective early care and education programs. As more programs are brought to scale, our ability to achieve greater impacts for all children rests on having a more nuanced understanding of how early care and education programs and policies are being implemented locally, and also on understanding the differential impacts on specific subgroups of children. Implementation research enables meaningful exploration of what works for whom and under what conditions. Designs capture the ever-evolving context in which early care and education researchers, practitioners, and policymakers work, encompassing the multiple layers of policy, operations, programmatic decisions, resource allocations, political environments, and surrounding conditions in real-time on-the-ground interventions. With implementation research, issues of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, cultural and linguistic background, immigration status, and gender can be explicitly investigated within the context of program implementation. Conducting sound, rigorous, and high-quality early care and education implementation research to build evidence for the field is no easy task. We hope to encourage a new generation of applied researchers to engage in implementation early care and education research. As Jacqueline mentioned, our new resource, Getting It Right, the Conversation Guide for Preparing the Next Generation of Implementation Researchers, was created to help faculty and institutions of higher education initiate and sustain conversations with their students about implementation research. In today's discussion, our speakers discuss what higher education is doing and can do better to prepare future researchers to have the knowledge and skills necessary to conduct strong implementation research. Our speakers will explore the opportunities and challenges related to the preparation of implementation researchers in the early care and education field, and also discuss how to prepare and support researchers, particularly researchers of color, as they work to obtain the knowledge and skills necessary to become effective implementation researchers. Our featured speakers today that are helping us delve into these pivotal issues of the field include Dr. Rihanna Elise Anderson, an assistant professor in Health Behavior and Health Education Department in the University of Michigan School of Public Health. Dr. Nayana Blankson is a professor of psychology, director of the Inspire YouTube program, and program director of the RISE program at Spelman College. Dr. Timothy Getterman is an assistant professor in family medicine and an associate director of the Mixed Methods program at the University of Michigan. And Dr. Sharon Ryan is a professor of early childhood education in the Department of Learning and Teaching at Rutgers University, and is also the author of Chapter 11 in the original Getting It Right publication. Thank you everyone for being with us today. Before we begin, we briefly want to touch on a few logistics. If you're encountering technical difficulties, please alert us to the issue by submitting a comment in the chat box. At the end of today's roundtable discussion, we will have a Q&A session. Please submit your questions in the question box at any time during the webinar. While you may submit a question throughout the webinar, we will not look at those questions until the official question and answer period begins at the end of the roundtable. Thank you in advance for submitting questions, and please follow the Foundation on Twitter at FCDUS.org and use the hashtag #GettingItRight to share your thoughts about today's roundtable discussion. We would also like to thank Charisse Brammer, our communications officer, who helped plan this event today and is offering technical support. So with that, we can officially begin the roundtable discussion. Again, thank you all for participating. I'm going to start the questions with actually asking Nayana first to answer a question about how is higher education preparing future researchers, and what is being done well, and what areas need improvement?
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So as you know, I am a professor at an undergraduate institution. So I'll start off the conversation by talking about some of the things that I think are being done well to prepare undergraduates for future research careers, and then move into the graduate students as well. I think that one shift in higher education that's been of benefit to students is the shift from purely lecturing to the use of project-based approaches to teaching. And even before COVID, many classes were being taught using a flipped classroom approach. So if not fully flipped, there was a combination of lecture and hands-on activities and different types of projects. So through the use of those hands-on activities, students, and with students conducting research projects in class, they're able to go beyond the textbook and learn how to directly apply what they're learning in different contexts. And then outside of coursework, students are able to obtain experience through different avenues, such as engagement in summer research programs. And right now is a time that students can and should be looking out for those research programs. They're being advertised, and most applications will be due like in February. And so now is a really good time for students to be looking out for those opportunities and to apply. And students are able to also obtain experience working in research labs. Research labs can play a really strong role in preparing students because they're outside of the classroom and they are getting much more hands-on research experience. And this applies not only to undergraduates, but graduate students as well. And not only is it important for research students to obtain the research experience, but the mentorship that students obtain in the research lab is so important. And unfortunately, the reality is that not all researchers are mentors. And so when students are exploring for different research labs, they should think about the kind of mentoring experience that they would receive, you know, so that they can get experience in improving their strengths and finding out what their weaknesses are and improving their weaknesses. You know, sometimes the experience that students might get if they don't have proper mentorship will just be collecting data or entering data. And that's not really experience that's going to prepare them for the future. And so that mentorship is really key. And I think that the Getting It Right conversation guide is a great resource for being used in research labs, whether it's at the undergraduate level or at the graduate level, to foster conversations about different topics such as research design, early care and education, implementation research, equity and research. There's so many topics that are covered in the guide. And for me, I only have undergraduates in my research lab, but I can see applying this guide in coming up with different conversations to talk to my students about, so that they can think about the types of research opportunities that are available to them once they graduate and leave Spelman.
Perfect. Thank you, Niana. Would anyone else like to provide their thoughts and comments about higher education and the preparation? Sharon, go ahead.
So I just want to echo what Niana said about mentorship. I can't stress enough to anyone out there who's interested in doing graduate level work or undergraduate level work, how you should go and interview people that you may want to work with. I work with some very esteemed researchers, megastars, but not all of them provide their students with the same opportunities or give them the kinds of feedback and input and support that they need to really learn how to be a researcher in all of its multiple roles, which is not just doing research, I should say. And the other thing I'd like to add is that in addition to research labs, which I think are often associated in early childhood as a field, we don't necessarily always talk research labs. We do in psychology and other disciplines, but certainly when you get into the graduate world, a lot of hands-on experience through apprenticeships, through working with your mentor on projects. And you should look for, in any kind of doctoral program in particular, what kinds of opportunities are going to be provided to allow you to get that hands-on experience. I know for me as a mentor, the joy I have gotten from working with wonderful students and how much I learned from them, but also I know that being able to offer them opportunities to work on projects with me not only helps me, it really enables them to get a first-hand experience of all the intricacies of field work and data analysis.
Sarah, I'll jump in here too. I think both of the points have been fantastic that we've heard thus far. And I might start just a bit earlier, because I think when I was in undergrad, when I heard the word research, I had a lot of negative connotations about that, right? So I was told very early on about some of the abuses that happened in the research world, and didn't feel comfortable, quote, doing research, quote, on people, right? Like I felt very disconnected with that concept, and as a consequence did not do research in undergrad. I found myself doing community organizing. I was out with professors who were with amongst the people, and I saw myself as very different in that way. I didn't understand that there were different types of research, and in fact what I was doing was a part of research. It was just called something different at that time. So I would also encourage you, if you're finding yourself as an undergrad listening to this, or if you mentor people who are in undergrad, really getting into what does research mean? What are the expanses of research? What are the different ways that you can work with folks? And especially because we're having an eye toward applied work here, what are the different ways that we work with communities rather, you know, again, on conducting the research on, or some of the pejorative terms that we may have learned about or heard about ourselves coming up, how we can actually help folks to understand what it looks like and what it feels like to be a part of research that feels good for them.
I think that's a really great point, Rihanna, is that there's so many different ways in which we can get research experience. And when students are, even when they're thinking about applying to graduate school, some of them might think, oh, I don't have research experience. But if they really think about it, that internship that they had, they were doing research in it. The class that they took, you know, they did research there. The job that they're working in, maybe that job has some kind of research involved in it. And so it's really important for students to understand what exactly research is and what are the different ways to obtain these types of experiences.
All right, so one thing that also the foundation does is not just think about early career scholarship and how higher education, right, can support that. We have our Young Scholars Program, which is really focused on supporting researchers early on in their career and does have a prioritization for scholars of color. So we also wanted to get some of your thoughts on what you think are the equity issues that are involved in higher education when preparing future implementation researchers, and what you think the pipeline looks like for researchers of color, and how you think that higher education can better support researchers of color. And Rihanna, could you start this one off?
Sure, yeah. So for folks who may or may not understand what the pipeline is, it is looking at, from an earlier standpoint to an end standpoint, how many folks are included and get carried along throughout different junctures that might connect to one another. So from high school to college, college to grad school, et cetera. So in some of the work that my colleagues and I have done in looking at some of these numbers, and I pulled it up just to make sure that my old memory was connecting with it. So if you have 100 students in high school who are African American or Latina, and then you go to college, you see a pretty significant drop off for both of those groups. So if you have 100 students who started high school or college, maybe 75%, 65% for Black and Latina respectively graduate from high school. Then to college, we have about 21% and 13% respectively. Then when you're talking about the PhD, getting to that advanced degree, we're looking at less than 1. And in fact, we're about a half for Black folk, 0.5%, and 1/3% for Latinas. So we're talking a pretty significant drop off from each pipeline to the other. And in that way, we call it a leaky pipeline. That means that we're not talking about a consistent current of stream that's going from the start of that to the end. We're talking about spaces in which there are leaks that are happening. So Sarah, when I'm hearing your question, it really connects back to what we were saying in the first discussion around how does one get through, and not just through, right? Because I don't want folks just to come out cobbling at the end like, oh, we made it. Like, I don't want folks to experience really what I experienced, where you're just making it through. I want you to thrive. I want you to be very successful. So there are really 3 things that we think about with respect to recruitment, transition, and retention. So recruitment programs, and Naina was describing some of the work that she does at Spelman. There are a number of programs that think about how do we talk to folks at the stage before where we are and help to integrate them into our work. So if I have a high schooler that reaches out to me, we invite them to the lab, we talk to them about what it looks like, we mentor them in whatever way that we can, so that we're going as early as possible to integrate them into the work. So recruitment can mean going quite early. It can be intentionally asking or going into communities to talk to folks who don't, who aren't represented in the same way that you would want them to be at your university or in your program. So we're talking an intentional and an early system of recruitment. The transition is something that, again, I think is crucial. When I mentioned this idea of even explaining what research is, sometimes we think it's enough just to reach in, access, talk to folks, and say these words that for folks who are in certain communities may be really saddled with challenging memories or stories. So that transition piece, not assuming that people know how to do it, not assuming that people know what these words are, what the process is, really being explicit about grounding, about, oh, that's not the word, what is it? When you what is it? When you bring somebody in, help, brain fart.
Integrate?
In onboarding, sorry. Good try, thank you so much. When you're onboarding folks, right, you wanna make sure that you are thinking about spending that energy and time at the beginning, because that's going to be the payoff. If you have to continue to address or redress things that are coming up later that you didn't think about, that's going to cause some, again, additional leaks in the pipeline. So you have to think very early on, if you're connecting those 2 pieces of pipe, how do you secure it in a way that is clear? It has very just clear expectations, very logical things that people need to know to be successful very early on. So that's that transition piece. And then the retention piece, again, not assuming that at the end of every year, someone is going to just say, I'm going to stay in grad school. This is the right place for me. We just had a discussion in another webinar that I'm on right now, but we just had a discussion about this time, COVID, plus racial uprising, plus all the things that are happening, there shouldn't be a sense that people are just going to keep going. People are just going to move along. There are some really critical things that are happening in the lives of people. So how do you support them during these crisis periods? How do you say at the end of the year, we want you to come back? What are the things that we need to do better? How can we support you more? What would be crucial for you to come back to do this work, right, effectively, to feel supported? So having those conversations and not assuming for communities that are really experiencing challenging times right now that this is a given, that they would want to continue making $10,000 a year and not being a part of their communities to learn this work outside of it oftentimes. So those are a few thoughts that I would have, Sarah, to offer to this question.
Yeah, those are.
I'd like to.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Tim.
Well, I just want to offer kind of another take on this. I think there are some things that we do in the academy that honestly actively discouraged individuals of color from entering research. So, Rihanna, you mentioned that you had some I don't know when you call it different perceptions of what research is. And I think a lot of that's rooted in how we talk about research and how we write about research. I mean, obviously we know of lots of bad things that have happened, research on individuals where they weren't consented and that sort of thing. But there are also a lot of terms we use that are problematic. Human subjects. I mean, that sounds kind of weird, actually. I don't want to be a human subject, with others. Use of terms like a target population when we're writing about research, those sorts of things bring up connotations, and I think they seem subtle, perhaps, at face value, but I think ultimately over time, these just add to sort of reasons for not even thinking about a research career or shying away from it. So I think there are lots of things that we can do in higher education to remove that sort of language. And there's some people who have been writing about this lately that I think will ultimately, improve some of that pipeline, or at least hopefully remove some barriers to entering the pipeline.
And then, Nana, you were going to jump in. Do you want? And then.
Oh, sure. I was, yeah, the points that I've made are really great, and I agree with what's been said. And I think that getting students to know, we've talked about it already, getting students to know what research is. Sometimes students come into my lab and they're like, oh, I didn't know that this was what research is. Oh, I actually like it. And so that's important. But another challenge that happens too is that sometimes students cannot afford to volunteer in research labs, and that can be a hindrance. So the students might be interested in getting that experience, but they can't volunteer in labs. They have to work, and so that's something that needs to be fixed to to seal the leak in the pipeline as well.
I just want to add to what everyone's saying about this notion of retention and transition, in that higher education environments aren't very friendly often, particularly predominantly white institutions. And the research enterprise has not been based on the experiences of a many, but of a few. And there are certain fields that have more precedence, more value, more status. And applied research is not one of those, I might add, and nor is education, and nor is health, and I can go on, right? So I think it's also about those of us who work. I mean, we know just from studies in higher ed, just that sense of belonging that students may or may not have from the moment they enter and they transition into a higher ed environment of any kind. And there's so much we can do, and yet it's so overlooked by so many of us. Like, faculty have been seen as pivotal in supporting or, in enhancing people, any individuals feeling like they belong on campus, particularly those in predominantly white environments. And yet you know, if you were to ask me what trainings are available to faculty in my huge, gigantic state university, it would be about how to use Canvas, right? And I want people, don't get me wrong, I want people to do classes and stuff on how to be a better teacher. Don't get me wrong. But at the same time, not being aware that just the way you interact with someone when they come to your door, or they're in your hallway, or they're walking down the street, conveys messaging about what the institution is, who it cares about, and what it values, and therefore where research fits. And I'm in a research one in university, so we love research, love it. But that doesn't mean we always think about who our next generation of researchers are going to be, unless they, you know, apply to us and want to be seen by us. And then we make it really hard. You know, we create all of these layers of expectations and how you apply and what's required of you that don't make it easy for anyone. But particularly those who are from first generation backgrounds, for example, it's incredibly difficult. So I think even rethinking our environments and how they're structured is a really important way to help people feel welcomed. I know just in my own school, we've tried really hard, but you know, if you were to talk to some of our students of color, I'm not sure they would all speak highly of how much they feel like they belong within our programs.
And that sense of belonging is so important, Sharon. The equity issues go from the you know, undergraduate level and before all the way into faculty, you know, and we know there are not many non-white faculty in institutions of higher education. And when students are able to see people like them, you know, they feel like they belong. And the pipeline is broken all the way through the faculty level as well. And so that retention, you know, recruiting, Rihanna missed the second thing that you mentioned, but the recruiting and retaining non-white faculty is so important in that pipeline.
Yeah, it's sort of like a whole multi-dimensional thing, right? So it's recruitment, retention, support of students. It's recruitment, retention, support of scholars of color. And then it's about thinking about the entire environment so that white faculty like myself are able to talk about these issues, are able to be aware of their privilege within the institution and how the institution always will privilege whiteness, right? It feels like it always will, right? So, and how to rethink that when you are in every interaction you have within a school. And it's something, you know, we don't think about enough, right?
Yeah, even things such as the types of research questions that are deemed acceptable by students. You know, a student might come in, they have a research question, but it might not be deemed acceptable, and they might leave a program for that reason because they weren't able to research the things that they were interested in.
Yep.
And that shows back up to NIH, where NIH doesn't fund that type of research. So even if you do stay around and you spend decades asking community-based questions and then you apply to NIH, there's a trigger of like, oh, this is what is associated with that. Like, I'm not going to fund those things, but there's also a connection to who's more likely to utilize that type of research. So it's, I mean, it is pretty dismal, and I want to, Sharon, well, everyone, I really want to appreciate the perspectives. You know, it's certainly not a unidimensional issue. It's all of these things together. But I think the thing that drives all of this is money. Like, just, we got to underline it, circle it, star it. Like, money is the thing that, again, you can't recruit someone for a $10,000 program that who may need to help support family or whatever, and then have a certain position that's not going to get funded with NIH. Like, I mean, it's throughout the whole thing. Like, the money is what drives and what, you know, talks of, it's what talks. So I really think that if we are saying this matters, we have to put the money behind it to actually support those initiatives.
Coupled with leadership, really good leadership, you know, people who have a vision for what we're trying to change and can channel the funding and the resources into innovative programs and places to go. because I think that's what happens. You know, we don't always think about the what we're trying to achieve, what our end goals are with certain kinds of funding, and therefore, you know, sort of how we're going to make sure it takes place and all that sort of stuff. I worry sometimes about, well, not sometimes, quite a lot about leadership in terms of making these decisions, right? Even if they have money. Right?
Well, this has been helpful because you really have pinpointed that it must be a deliberate and intentional effort, right, to create this pipeline, and that even institutions of higher education sit within a system, right, of research as well. And so with that in mind, we also have a next question that's really more specific, not just about preparing future researchers, but really focusing the field on implementation research, which hopefully, Rihanna, is maybe more in line with some of the questions, right, that scholars of color have. And so, Sharon, will you kick us off and talk a little bit about how you think graduate programs are specifically supporting researchers in understanding implementation research, and especially in the early care and education field?
Glad you put early care and education on there on the end. I was getting worried. I can't speak to all graduate education, and I certainly can't speak to implementation research in multiple fields. One of the things that's really interesting about early childhood, one of its strengths and one of its weaknesses, is that the field is interdisciplinary. There are people who focus on children's development. There are people who focus on families. There are people who focus on workforce issues. There are people who focus on policy and systems. There are people who focus on programs. So that's a really great strength. But it also means that we're incredibly siloed, right? And we're in a field which has been and continues to be undervalued. You know, things are sort of looking up, but you know, you just never know with this pandemic and everything else that's been happening in the world. I don't know about you, but this week's been a little crazy. So the way people are, I can't say that there's a number of graduate programs focused specifically on implementation research in early childhood. What I can say is there tends to be two tracks. In some universities where you go, it'll just be a PhD. And I don't mean just like, oh my God, it's just a PhD. More like, oh my God, it's PhD. And that PhD will cover everything. And early childhood may be one of those foci, right? So there's the same assumptions, same sort of set of criteria. Those criteria typically involve some kind of methodological preparation, usually in more than one methodology. At Rutgers, our students have to do, if they're qualitatively oriented, they have to do 3 classes in qual, but then they still have to do at least 1 basic class in statistics. And they also do pro seminars that give them a sense of the field. And then there's a lot of research practice oriented experiences. So that's where I think people learn implementation research. A lot of them learn it not from a course focused on implementation research or a program of research focused on implementation research, but much more on a set of apprenticeship experiences where they are being encouraged to try different kinds of research out, to write about it, to present at conferences, and this is with good mentoring, of course, and to get opportunities to review research and to learn what it's like to sort of even put in a conference proposal, and they get that all the way along. That's one group. And then in education, what we have is also the EDD, which started off at Harvard and Teachers College, my alma mater, which is very much about and was very much just like a PhD. So if you went to Harvard, you could only get an EDD, and if you went to Teachers College, you could only get an EDD if you were interested in educational issues. If you were interested in psychology, you could possibly get a PhD, but not in things like policy and education. Now, with the Carnegie Project for the Education Doctorate, there's been a great deal of work to try and differentiate between what we're trying to create with people who work in the field who want to become researchers, not to be in a university, but to actually use research to inform practice, which personally I think all educational researchers should be trying to do, but also in ways that is really can help transform practice quickly, speak to multiple audiences, you know, in formats that speaks to multiple audiences, and that addresses sometimes quite tiny problems of practice, which I would call problems of implementation, right? So why is it that we're having, and I'm working with one of my doctoral students on this now, why is it there's such a disproportionate number of our students of colour are identified for special ed in pre-K? I don't get it, because that's like a, that means they're going to be segregated into special ed probably for the rest of their career in school and in my district. So in our EDD at Rutgers, but in other EDDs, the idea is to really sort of hone in on research for practice, research on implementation. And in doing so, that means we try and focus on helping people answer research questions that are definitely researchable, right? But that are in ways that are going to directly inform something that happens in their backyard. And so some of those programs have grown across the country. They're in places like Harvard, and you'll see, and the institution of higher ed has changed, certainly in education, to have more professors of practice who are often encouraged to research about their practice. But if you were to say to me, where do I find programs of research preparation on implementation research, I would say that's more in other fields, not in education. What I can find in early childhood is if I'm really interested in policy, I can go to I may be able to find a program in early childhood policy, but I can't always. And so that's where it comes down to really having a fantastic mentor who can, and if they say to you, no, this is my research, this is what you're going to do, that to me is not good mentoring, right? It's efficient, but it's not productive, because it doesn't nurture the next generation of researchers. For me, it's about saying, okay, so you want to investigate this. This is what I know about it, but this is what I don't know about it. And I'm going to encourage you to go and get these experiences with these people, right? And I also think being, higher education, one of the dilemmas is where we have a star system, right? So the more mega you are, the more money you bring in, doesn't mean you always collaborate with others. But to do really effective implementation research, you have to be able to collaborate, not just with other, researchers, but with policymakers, with teachers, with leaders, with families, because you want people to be able to understand your research and to be able to take it up. And so that's where I've really been proud in the work I've done here at Rutgers to be able to say in our EDD, we're going to teach you how to communicate this information to multiple stakeholders, like how to create a policy brief, how to make a report look pretty so that you can work with leaders across four of your schools to do this. But I think we have a long way to go, because implementation research is, and what the book, Getting It Right, will educate people about, is that it is really complex. And someone like me may do most of my work around implementation with teachers and leaders and families and children, but there's a lot of other people that I work with, like Dr. Steve Barnett, who does his work at a state level, right? And so, or at a national level, or at an international level. But we all have different insights that we need to bring together. And I think good research preparation, while there may not be a program that says we're just going to teach about implementation research, but it's really about that careful mentoring, and then thinking about, in our programs of research, how do we teach people to speak to different audiences about the data they have generated? How do you carve it off so that for this group of people, we're going to talk about this because this is what matters to them? And I have to say that the only way I learned that, even though I was mentored by one of the best in the field, Dr. Celia Ganeshi, who taught me how to be a researcher, she really did, and to be a scholar, was by working with people like Steve Barnett, by working with Jacqueline Jones, by working with Marcy Whitebook. These are all leaders in my field who really have always tried to cross over between research and practice. So I guess, again, I think it's a lot of experience with careful mentoring and choosing the right program that works for you. But it's like a shopping list.
There's so many excellent points there, Sharon. That mentoring is so important, and being able to pick the right fit for you is really key. And with this research, as you mentioned, it's interdisciplinary, it's multifaceted. There's so many things going on, and being able to learn how to present your research to other audiences, having a mentor who'll teach you that and who'll let you know that this is something that is important for you to understand in this field is such a key. So I agree with all the points that you just made.
And I should say, you know, where Rihanna was talking about community-based work, which is what I think good implementation research is. You can go from the ground, from local to larger, and from larger to local, right? But I think for me, it's about learning that you can do research in that way, right? Trying to convince some people that it's important to do it that way is one of the challenges I think I face in higher education. But I think you learn so much. So if you do an evaluation study and say I'm working with state policymakers and they say, no, we want to know this, or some of the work I've just done with the Foundation for Child Development, no, this is, you know, they kept on saying to me, you keep on labeling these people wrong. And it was a time use study of what we were calling coaches, but really it was site support personnel. It was by having those conversations with the people who were actually going to use the report, hopefully, that made me realize as a researcher I was wrong. Right, I was mislabeling this group of people who were doing very important work, and so I think teaching people that's a good place to start, and to listen to the users, the end users of what, as Patton would say, of what people, you know, of what they want the research to be, and help them with, not to give them the answers they want, but to help them understand, yes, we're here to work with you, right? And that to me means being methodologically flexible, and I think that that's where we really, I'll be frank, fail many of our students in preparation programs. I didn't learn really good statistics or how to use them or how to apply them well until I did my own research study and I was thrown in the deep end. And but I do think we need more researchers who can work across not only orientations, but to not think about certain orientations like qualitative, quantitative in narrow ways, right? Because, for example, if you think about issues of power, politics, and equity in research, there's this whole new great work being done by quantitative critical researchers, right? Which I think is really powerful, but sometimes quant gets a bad rap by some of my colleagues in critical qualitative work, right? And so, but the two together can be extremely powerful.
And that really speaks to the importance of training our students in how to build research teams. You know, right. Sometimes I don't think that's often done, and sometimes research can seem a bit daunting because there's so much to know. But when students realize that, oh, you don't have to know everything, you can build a team and put together people who know different things, who have expertise in different areas, and the team has all of the knowledge that's needed, from the coming up with the research questions all the way through to the end and disseminating the research. Putting together that team is important, and training our students in how to form relationships with others so that they can establish those community partnerships, or bring in that quant person on their committee, or bring in a qualitative person onto their team, is an important skill to train our students in.
I really want to just echo that point. Timothy, I don't know if you know the Michiganism, the team. I hope that you would. Okay, great. Michigan football, it will get you. But our thought is about the team, and I want to quantify that a bit for folks. Just if you haven't heard about team-based approaches, or if you don't know why they would be beneficial, there's two connected reasons why I want to implore you that this is really important. So when the NIH thinks about the stage model of working from a basic idea all the way to implementation, there's 5 different stages. And so people are working on it from in their labs, basic science, then it goes into a small pilot, and then from that pilot it goes into a larger trial, and then into the community for efficacy, effectiveness. There are all these different stages that then eventually get scaled all the way up. That takes 17 years. So the reason that I think it's really important to say that and to give it a number is because if we're talking early childhood, we're saying that something that we're identifying in a 4-year-old now, that person is going to be legal, right? They're going to be 21 by the time we actually get that work into the world, and it's too late at that point. We know that intervening early is going to be cost effective, it's going to be more efficient and more effective outcome-wise for that child. So we know that there is an absolute imperative to intervene early. Yet our research often takes, if we are the only individuals trying to engage in it, it can take up to 17 years plus to actually implement that work. So it's a moral imperative for people to work across those stages to say, if I'm the basic researcher, yet I know somebody who's doing effectiveness or efficacy work, we should team up because I have data that's going to be really critical for them in the work that they're doing. So that 4-year-old is maybe 6 by the time we get it to them, and it's not too late, right? That whatever the environmental or social stressor is that's doing what it do to that kid is not going to do so much by the time they're 18, 19 for when our work is actually ready to go out into the field. So that's just something, when I'm talking about the moral imperative, the absolute reason that I'm an applied interventionist is because I don't want the babies who I'm working with now to be adults experiencing these same problems. It really takes the team-based approach, and there's a rationale for why we should be doing it now.
Agreed.
And I really like what you said, Sharon, about the combination of quantitative and qualitative as well, because sometimes people think that, oh, they're separate, you do one or the other, but now there's the, more training in mixed methods. And for me, my PhD is in quantitative psychology, but what some folks don't know is that when I was, in my quant PhD program, I also took a couple of anthropology classes to broaden my knowledge about different types of research methods and not purely quantitative methods.
But I would also add to that it's also about multiple theoretical lenses, right? Sorry, Tim.
No, go ahead.
No, I'm done.
Yeah, no, I just want to, agree with that. And, my specialty is mixed methods. So of course I'm passionate about it, but, I firmly believe that our research questions or aims should drive our choice of methods. And, there are times where, I would certainly let go of using mixed methods because it just doesn't fit for, whatever reason. So I just want to reiterate what everyone has said, that I think it's about, being open to, what tools you actually need in order to address questions, drive impact, drive change, whatever that might be. And it could be quantitative, qualitative, a mix, or something else entirely.
So Tim, you kind of just gave a rundown a little bit of maybe what some of the knowledge and skills are needed for being an effective researcher or implementation researcher. Do other folks have some idea of what, if you were talking to a student, what you would share with them as to what you think makes somebody an effective researcher, either from approach or content knowledge?
I'd go, say what I mentioned before about being able to build that team, and that you don't have to know everything, to be an effective researcher, an effective implementation researcher. And understanding what you don't know can also be important, and being able to form those relationships with others, whether it's the policy. If you're working in schools, you need to be able to get into the schools and know what their rules and regulations are, or you have to have somebody who knows that so that they can assist you to get into those schools. And so I think it goes back to the point earlier about mentorship. Having that mentor who guide you through the entire process is important.
I really think that it's important. I do think it's important for researchers to be able to work across differences and to see possibilities around the same problem, because every problem can be investigated in multiple ways. For me, it's also choosing the right theoretical lens. And again, I think what's happened in my field is I can find a journal that will just take critical scholarship, and I can find a journal that will just take quantitative scholarship on child development, but I can't find journals that very rare that will include all of them, all of the different perspectives. But I think there's something to be said when you can bring researchers into a room and really question or challenge or talk about those differences. And I don't think that happens enough, right? Because, well, in my world, it's not encouraged. You know, I'm supposed to count up how many first author publications I have to get to the next level. And so I do think the system sometimes makes it hard for us to do that. But I do think I want new researchers to have an openness to understanding whatever they're interested in from multiple perspectives. But I want them to be able to situate that in a larger understanding of the way the educational systems have been structured to be inherently biased and reproductive of the values and opportunities for some people and not others, to understand that there are tools that you can use as a researcher to help you understand those issues and to look at them. But also I want them to be able to situate their problem in this broader idea and to understand that whatever they look at, say I take the early childhood workforce, which is one of the things I do, I can look at development of teachers from a very technical, rational way, or I can look at it in terms of work organization, which is labor studies, or I can look at it in terms of teacher-child interactions. I can look at it in terms of teacher ed. I can look at it in terms of professional development and adult learning theory. I really want to encourage my students to be able to sort of have that breadth of knowledge, but also couple that with an openness to being able to work across differences and to be able to justify certain choices and to say, well, I can answer these set of questions now, and then I've got a game plan to go to the next one that you can build on what you do. It's not just getting through one project at a time. And for me, that means being more methodologically fluid and flexible, which doesn't always help your career, I might add, because you have to learn something new. But in doing so, you become a better, for me, I have anyway, I think, become a better researcher because of it. You know.
And the point about the theoretical perspectives connects with what we talked about earlier about equity too, because when thinking about theoretical perspectives and the research that we conduct, there are few theories that apply to, them that were derived, focused on non-white individuals. And so we can, teach our students this and talk to them about it and get them thinking about ways in which they themselves can be theorists as well, and through their research can add to our knowledge and the different theoretical perspectives that there are.
All right, any final thoughts on some career advice for future implementation researchers? No? Okay.
So,
Tim, go ahead.
I mean, yeah. So, as far as career advice, just to reiterate some things, having a mentor, of course, is important. I would also, encourage people, especially at the undergraduate level, to become familiar with resources at your university. Most universities have undergraduate research experience programs that go by various names. I've had worked with many students over the years at the University of Michigan, and it's typically a really good experience for all. And it's a chance for you to really experience research and how it's done. And I say this, from one of my own themes of research, which is around research capacity building, where, I think really the best way to learn and develop skills or know-how is to actually conduct research and be part of it. And, there are lots of factors that come into finding a good mentor and that sort of thing. As far as implementation research, I work across disciplines. I'm technically in a medical school. I have no medical training whatsoever. So I'm kind of comfortable with that. But, in terms of implementation, there are lots of different implementation frameworks, and some of those come from other disciplines outside of education, for instance. Health sciences has many of these. So I would, reach out and become familiar with some of those. I think sometimes we can learn from other disciplines, and part of it is breaking down some of those silos of how we think about things and how we operate, and meeting people and getting to know people who think about things a different way, maybe use different approaches. I think that can be really, really helpful in terms of developing your own skills and really becoming an implementation researcher.
All right. I actually have been looking to the right. There have been several questions that are submitted. So I think actually it would be a good time to switch to the live Q&A so that we can get to some of the questions that folks submitted. And let me just remind the audience members to please submit questions to the question box and not the chat box in order to submit your questions. So I'm going to start off with the first one here. Really like the distinction, Rihanna, that you made between how research can be implemented and conducted with communities and not on communities. And so the question is, how are research institutions or universities fostering this form of research that is needed? Can anybody can respond, but Rihanna, would you like to start off?
Yeah, so I'm really mindful of potentially the different levels of rank on the call. So I think it's important to note that virtually every single one of my mentors has told me do not do community engaged research as a pre-tenured person. That doesn't resonate well for me, and much to their chagrin, I'm still doing it. So I just think that it's important for you to know the politics and the expectations at your university. But I think one thing that can be really helpful as you're navigating this is always having something in the pot over here while you're doing the work over there. So community engaged work takes a substantial amount of time and energy, and for people who have engaged in it, and especially if you're kind of just getting started, it might take years before you make inroads in the work that you're doing. So I'm bringing that up because if you are talking to your university about wanting to do that, or if universities are thinking about whether they want to support this type of work, it's going to be hard fought if you're saying, I'm not going to be publishing at all, I'm not going to get any grants whatsoever, like none of that's happening, I'm just doing this work. I don't think that there's any problem with that whatsoever, but from where the academy is right now, right, it has leagues to go, but where it is right now, it would really behoove you to say, and I'm also doing this survey-based work or this qualitative, like whatever work I have going on right here. I have these partnerships, I'm on this team. If you can sell the idea that you're not going to be engaged in work, which especially as a pre-tenure person, if you engaged in it for 4 or 5 years and didn't get the collaborations by the end, or if something were to happen like COVID, right, where everything that we were working toward just kind of fizzled, if you're in that type of situation, your university doesn't want you to be set up in a challenging way there. So I'm saying all this in a kind of a back way to answer the question that I think universities can and are willing to, in a great number of ways, support community engaged work. And certainly at the University of Michigan and other institutions that have very strong community based programs, there are a lot of often senior people who are doing the work because they have more flexibility to do that, they have the track record. But if you are junior and you're looking to do that, I think you can go to your university with a more assured bet that they would encourage you if you have multiple pots of brewing. That would be my thought. What about other folks?
Yeah, I agree that especially with junior faculty, it depends on the institution, right? So learning your institution and seeing what is most acceptable for advancing in your field in that institution, by having, whether you're junior or senior, having multiple things going on is good. And then with the community engagement, it connects back to some of what we've talked about already with maybe you're a basic researcher, but you're connected with somebody who does more applied things, or maybe you're the applied person, but you connect with somebody who's basic. So the collaboration and, you know, forming relationships with others can also be part of your research research agenda and growth in research.
I'm curious, do you think it is possible to change institutions of higher education in terms of tenure decisions? And do you think that it could be possible that the research that is with the community and is more applied, you know, would be equally respected from a tenure perspective? Like what will it take, do you think, in institutions to kind of change the current status? Anybody have some thoughts about how to change the status quo?
I do think universities are having to be more accountable and more engaged than they've ever been before, which I think is how they should have been in the first place, but that's good. And I do think that there is hope in that, for example, my university actually asks for teaching portfolios now, which it didn't before for tenure. And if you want to keep on being promoted, you can do that. And we have various kinds of opportunities for scholar leaders, scholar researchers. But I don't know if it's possible to change a very large institution that way. I think what's interesting for me is I am in an applied field, right? That our work is in the community. That's what educators do, and yet we've sort of had to get tenure, do our work that sort of doesn't acknowledge that always, and so I think one thing that's really important is not only the collaborations with people within an institution, but also getting the right. We talked about mentoring in terms of research preparation. You actually need mentoring, I think, to navigate higher ed once you get a job, right? I mean, I still go to my mentors for certain things, even now, and I've been doing this for quite a while, you know. So,
Yeah,
I think there's hope.
I think there is hope. It can start with faculty, because tenure and promotion rules and regulations, I think at most institutions, I mean, I know at Spelman, it's the rules and regulations for it were developed by the faculty. And so if faculty at the different institutions come together and discuss ways how to change what the rules and regulations are, you know, then of course it has to be voted on or go through whatever process. But faculty can make that change to the extent that, you know, they're willing to go through the work.
Okay, we have another question here, which I'm going to read out to folks. What role can research societies, professional societies, and foundations play to train and develop research skills among undergraduate students and especially students of color?
I can talk, you know, I can talk a little bit about that. So different research societies, some support summer programs, you know, so, and Rihanna was talking about it before, money, you know, so providing funds to either host summer programs or support students during the academic year to be in research labs. So these organizations can, I think, play a really large role, especially if they intend to, you know, maybe they can be part of that pipeline where they support students, and eventually the students, you know, they might have the student affiliation with the organization, but maybe later they're doing some other larger role in the organization as well. So I think that these organizations can play more of a role than they probably do.
Yeah, I think it's a great question and a great idea, actually. And I would agree they could probably play a larger role, but I think there are so many different ways that could happen, you know, making it easier for undergraduates to come to conferences, for instance, and experience some of that, you know, some specific programs, you know, thinking organizations I'm a part of, often there are grants, they're you know, often kind of geared towards a very, very specific call, but it could be a call that would, allow more support of undergraduates, for instance, to engage people in research. Yeah, I think it's a really, really good idea.
Anybody have a thought of what foundations can do? That was also included in this question.
I think that might be the connection, right? So there's a lot of the societies I'm a part of, like child development or adolescence, they have these pre-conference events, and there are a number of junior scholar programs that I've been at all levels of, the baby, the middle mentor, the big mentor. Like I've been at all levels of that. The one kind of concern I have there is that the competition keeps getting higher and higher for these undergrads, and we keep going back to mentorship. And if you're not someone who's already connected, I think it's going to continue being these divisions that are created. So foundations could potentially team up with the SRAs and the SRCDs to offer either more slots or like a program that's more of a bridging, like how would you even get to that mentored program? But certainly there can be these connections with these societies of how can we support more people financially. And I think that is such a huge barrier to so many of these conferences. And we're talking about, virtual spaces that are going to allow people to at least know what a conference is like. So on the one hand, that's very good. But if conferences do go back to in person, it's going to continue to be this division of who can afford to actually get there and be a part of it, meet their favorite professor there, have the lunch or the tea like that. Those are important networking spaces. So I really think societies and foundations can team up to afford folks with fewer resources the opportunities to go.
And they can also reach out to institutions and different departments and programs to establish the relationships there to recruit students into whatever the programs that they might have that are being offered. Because sometimes students aren't aware, but if you connect with the faculty at this different institutions, they can guide the students to applying for different opportunities.
Or maybe it's about partnering with, like, most universities have different cultural institutions, as well as, like, we have an undergraduate research program supposed to contribute to networking, etc. I wonder, but it's mostly focused on, do you want an Aresti fellow to come and do your research? So then as a professor, you work with them. But I'm just thinking foundations might be able to look at partnering with those kinds of strategies that are already embedded within universities. So that you start recruiting people for the pipeline earlier, but you also give it a particular focus. So it's not like the so-and-so research center for undergraduate research. It's more like, this is focused specifically on implementation or on early care and education and health or whatever. But I do think one of the wonderful things about foundations is that they have more flexibility, I think. Well, from my perception, they have more flexibility in terms of being able to leverage change. And I certainly can speak to the New York City Research Network that I've been privileged to be a part of, in that brings people just doing research in early childhood that the Foundation for Child Development funds, among others. But it's been really great because we've been able to bring junior researchers or researchers who normally wouldn't get that opportunity to be part of such a group, because they might work in community colleges or they might work in a more teaching institution or whatever. It's really partnered people around real problems of practice, and then we come together, and I think that's been a great learning opportunity for everyone involved, no matter how senior or how mega they are.
Okay, well, definitely research to practice partnerships is an avenue to support scholarship. We have another question here. It's one of our audience members who would like to hear a little bit more from the panelists about field research and implementation projects that are currently in process or that are in the planning stages that you might all be involved in. So would anyone like to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about their current work? Rhiannon, I see you're nodding. Would you like to go next? First?
Sure, let's do it. I was nodding because I was just thinking about COVID, like, oh, when will I actually be able to do this? But I'm happy to talk about it. So my basic idea is, how do we drop kick racism? So if we know racism predicts a number of negative mental health outcomes for Black children and their families, how do we intervene? How do we kick that line a bit? And one of the ways that we do that is by talking to children about race. So parents engage in this through a process called racial socialization, or the talk, more commonly referred to as. And what I think about as a clinical psychologist is, how do we integrate that a bit better into therapy? So how do we have the talk with families, but then that also means, how do we have talks with therapists about race and being better at having those discussions? So it's kind of a twofold project where we're intervening with therapists themselves and families as well. Before March 9th, 2020, we were in person engaging in research with folks. I'm actually in Detroit at the University of Michigan Detroit Center, so I actively choose to live and work in Detroit relative to Ann Arbor, which is about 45 minutes away, and my community partners are a block away and like half a mile away this way. So we're at those centers, and then they can come to us as well, or we're working with families. Since that date, we have had to do a lot of flipping online, and so we still work with our partners, but it's a bit challenging to keep families jazzed on Zoom, frankly. So that's been challenging with implementation work over the past year and a half. But hopefully, if we are in a better space in the coming months, we'll be able to engage with them in person. But we're still thinking about utilizing online platforms to train people in a way that just having me or a train the trainer model might be limited. So thinking of implementation and technology and how we can put those two things together to train up more folks around the U.S. on how to talk to their clients about race more effectively. That's some of the work that we're doing. And then very quickly, we also work with, back to this team-based approach, we work with MIT on virtual reality, so that we're able to ask youth how they experience police stops or discrimination within classrooms, for example. And then we create the narrative on screen, and then they experience it, but they also can utilize whatever coping strategies they want. So it's a ecologically kind of lower risk space where children are able to practice coping strategies there, and we're also able to measure it in ways that are beyond just paper and pencil. So those are some of the both the therapeutic implementations and then the technological ways that we're trying to implement some of our work.
Thanks. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else want to talk a little bit about their current implementation or field research? Okay, we have another question here. So there was a lot of talk about mentors, and so this question is, how does one identify researchers in the academic world who will truly mentor students, as opposed to just supplying the experience that benefits the researcher's legacy? So secondly, how can we compel researchers to become better mentors? Anyone have some thoughts?
Well,
So I can start.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Just a couple things. I mean, I would say that, sort of treat reaching out to mentors as an interview almost, to see how both of you fit. I actually love the question when a student or potential mentee asks me about my mentoring style and, about past individuals that I've mentored and what that looks like. I think those are questions, that you should ask, and that, gets to how actively they'll be engaged with you and, how they're trying to foster your development. So, I would certainly think about that and really kind of approach it that way. And similarly, I think it's okay to ask around, talk to other mentees of this researcher or faculty member and get their take on it. That's maybe one of the best indicators actually of what your experience might be like.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And my graduate school mentor was John Horn of Crystallized and Fluid Intelligence fame. And when I went to graduate school, I did not know about talking to mentors or, interviewing others about mentors. But when I got there, he told me that, hey, here are a couple of my current or former students, talk to them, ask them about me. And that was such good advice. And so you can tell that he was a great mentor because he told me to find out about him. And so, you should do that and talk to the graduate students or, whoever that person has worked with in the past to learn about their mentorship and their mentorship style. So when I spoke with his former students, they told me some of the things to expect or, the way his mentoring style, and that's really important information to have. And so sometimes, of course, you should do this before you work with the mentor. It worked out for me, but you should learn about what kind of mentoring experience you're going to have and the fit, because if a mentor is really hands-off and you like that kind of relationship, then that will work for you. But if you need more feedback or assistance to grow, if you know that you're that kind of person, then a hands-off mentor will not work out for you. So use the information that you're getting from others and think about your own self with that information. So a mentor might not work well for some individuals, but it might work perfectly well for you. So it's all that information gathering, and then use that information to make an informed decision about the mentor that might work well for you.
I would also just add that it's not just the mentor, it's the program. So I always encourage people when they are interested to, I give them the names of students, not students who are necessarily going to give a great rap to the program, but I think it will be fair and honest. And I sort of say, so that they can ask about, the courses of study and, the community and what's the place like to live in and all those things, because that also makes a difference. I mean, but definitely, one should always interview people before you, which is what I did not do, but which you should do, I think, to really figure out if this is the right fit for you.
And I'll just add at the end, I think we've all done this like either nice incremental or this timeline kind of fashion. So now you've got the mentor, you're in the program, and say things aren't going as well as you would like. What I encourage you to think about is the Mr. Potato Head approach to mentoring, which is kind of the way that I've framed it. You're not looking at who that person is. Sometimes we say, oh, I want to work with Rihanna because like she's whatever in the field. No. What are the skills that this person is going to bring? So the mouthpiece, right, is going to help you to talk through some of these ideas that you have, or the hands are going to be able to help you to write, or the feet are the folks that are going to help you to network when you go to the conferences, right? So think about who those people are in your life, and if you have those skills rather than the name of the person. And sometimes you do have to bring multiple people together to get those skills. We sometimes want to put all of that in one person, but if you don't have all of that in your primary mentor, and you're not either at the maybe there's a political issue and why you can't get a new mentor, or maybe maybe you're too far into your program to switch, whatever that is, think about how can I add the skill sets of other people, whether they're at my university or school, or that I met at a society conference. If I saw them on a panel, how can I bring in some of their skills that are less frequent in nature, but are still very important for me to get through this program? So that's one of the strategies that I always encourage for folks going through.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, Rihanna, is that you don't have to have just one person as a mentor. And there's so many different ways in which people can mentor you. And even for me, I sit here as a full professor, but if I have different questions, there are people who I have who are my mentors who I still call, on for different questions for professional development or whatever it is. And they play different roles. and I know who I can call on for this question I have coming up, or who I can call on for, advice in different situations. And you need that to progress throughout, whatever career path that you're going to go down. You need those sources of people who'll give you advice along the way.
Okay, so this next question is referencing that colleagues at Michigan State University found COVID and travel limitations opened up new ways of thinking about how to recruit students to programs. And so they were curious, what new ways do you think higher ed is enacting equitable recruitment practices to graduate programs, especially for students of color who possibly can't afford to travel or go to recruitment events? So any other additional ideas about recruitment strategies?
I think we just first have to say go blue, Tim. No matter what, we just have to say go blue. I'm working on a recruitment committee in our School of Public Health. The only thing I'll add to what we've said before is that you have to know the organizations to tap. You can't just say like, hey, Spelman, or like, hey, you can't just be on Twitter like, I'm adding people of color to my infographic. Like, you have to say, this is the McNair Scholarship Program and they work with folk, and I'm going to talk to them and build a relationship with them. I'm going to go to this sororities event for their undergrads because it's likely that some of their members will want, like, you have to know those people, and that requires relationships, not this extractive way of just sending an email or just trying to posture. So it requires more than symbols, more than empty gestures. You really have to work on relationships, and that needs to be echoed again in that strategy of recruitment, transition, and retention, right? So I think it's really about the people element and that relationship that's going to show the efforts and actually get people to come versus just we symboled and we gestured and they didn't come and I don't know why.
Or they applied and they weren't accepted. You might get a whole lot of people applying, but are you really accepting the students?
Okay, so in line with your relationships emphasis, there's another question here that's saying, how can you build connections with others doing related work as a doctoral student or an early career researcher, especially for people who have to work outside of their programs and therefore may not have lots of extra time to give, or people who are in programs outside of education and child development and therefore don't have well-aligned faculty members? Any advice for how one goes about really building those connections and forming those relationships?
Well, I mean, there's traditionally networking at conferences and stuff like that. That's difficult, honestly, with virtual conferences. I haven't attended one that's sort of been an ideal model there. There are some virtual ways, though. There are things like ResearchGate, for instance, where you can network with other researchers. I'm on ResearchGate. I call it Facebook for research nerds like me, actually. But it is a way. I get people who contact me, and I contact people. It's a way to kind of connect, and I think it's really kind of neat actually to be a part of that community. You can reach out to people, of course. I welcome emails from students. Actually, I hear from people, periodically about a particular article or something like that. That might seem kind of intimidating, and I can't promise that you'll always get a response or a positive response, but I think a lot of people in academia probably would respond, or even point you to someone else who you might connect with. So I would think about some of those possibilities, and then of course asking around. At my institution, it's a very collaborative place, and most people are very willing to make an introduction to someone else, if that would really help you in your own education or career.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. So there's a question here that's asking a little bit about, we've mentioned today on the call, implementation research, applied research, mixed methods research. Does anyone want to talk a little bit about, are there distinctions between these different types of research? What do we mean by these terms?
Well, someone else jump in, but when I think of mixed methods research, I think of a study that's combining qualitative research and quantitative research, and most importantly, integrating the two. So they kind of they come together to produce something more. Applied research, I think of as addressing practical issues, a problem that we can address, trying to make the world a better place. And I think of implementation research is questions about things like programs and intervention that go beyond does it work, but looks at for whom does it work? Who's the best person to deliver this program? In what ways does it work? Why does it work? And all of those kinds of related questions. So that's my take on the distinction.
Everyone is agreeing with you, Tim.
Nice job.
Nice summary. So with that, actually, I think it concludes our roundtable discussion. So I would just like to thank all of the speakers today for sharing their time and expertise. I think we really appreciated the thoughts and insights you shared today about how higher education can help better prepare future researchers, and then all the advice that you gave actually to all of our early career researchers who are out here on the call today as an audience members. We'd also like to thank all of our attendees for joining us today and for submitting questions that were very helpful. We also would like to ask for our attendees to please complete our post-webinar survey, which seeks to ask some input from the audience for additional topics that the Foundation should host webinars for in the future. And then just a quick reminder of please visit the Foundation's website, which is fcd-us.org, to download the Foundation's publication, Getting It Right, the conversation guide for preparing the next generation of implementation researchers, and then the original publication which helped spur all of this, the Getting It Right, using implementation research to improve outcomes in early care and education. So we appreciate everyone's time and expertise today, and we wish everyone a great rest of the day and take care.
Thank you.